Hi, I'm Keegan, and this is a bunch of gamers. We're back with GM Talks, and I am joined once again by Mr. Eddy Webb of Onyx Path Publishing.
Hello, how are you doing?
And we're here to talk about Curseborne, the newest
Yes.
horror game from Onyx Path. So I think we'll just jump right into it. What kind of horror are we looking at? Like, I saw some stuff online about liminal spaces and things like that. What's the general vibe of this game, according to you?
Honestly, I think everyone you talk to in the CRISPR team probably has a slightly different take on it, which I think is good. It shows how broad and diverse it seems. But I mean, for me, it's definitely that kind of creepypasta urban myth style of horror. Because a lot of the conceit of the game is that everything is cursed on some level. Unlike our world, everything's awful and everything sucks. So, completely different. Maybe a hard stretch for people to kind of get on board with.
The curse was
Uh,
colonialism that we made along the
right,
way.
right. It's the secret of the game is everything is capitalism. That's the problem. No. It's so, but I mean, because of the conceit of that, they're just everything is on some level cursed, and that there's a lot of the kind of vibe of, I went down the wrong alley and saw someone getting stabbed, or my family is awful, and it turns out because they're literally monsters. So it's a very different vibe, I think, than we've done in other games where there's not some kind of overarching organization making everything horrible, which is much more kind of a '90s conspiratorial vibe. This is much more of the all the awful things you see on Instagram and TikTok are actually true on some level. That kind of very it's called street level, although I increasingly not a fan of that just because it implies a certain grunginess, which isn't necessarily a requirement.
Sure. And so I know this is probably in the mind of at least a few people listening here. Given Onyx Path's history, how does this game really stand out compared to, say, a World of Darkness or even a Chronicles of Darkness? Because it sounds like it's definitely closer to a Chronicles of Darkness than a World.
I don't think I've heard of those games before.
Not once.
Chronicles of Darkness? No, no. I mean, obviously, we're inspired by the work that we and others have done before in both those games. I mean, like everyone Onyx Path Publishing has worked on one or both those properties, and many of us have worked on quite a number of books in both those properties. So obviously, there's a lot of inspiration to be drawn from that. But I mean, to be honest, as much as I love both World Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness, World Darkness was very much built in the early '90s, and Chronicles of Darkness was a reimagination of those specific assumptions on some level. Like I said, the conspiratorial vibe, how we relate to conspiracy is very different. When Vampire the Masquerade first came out, that was like right before X Files hit really big. That was a very specific period in time, and that kind of everything is not true, and there are organizations out there that are manipulating the world from behind the scenes is a very specific aesthetic. And when Chronicles Darkness kind of spun off of that back when it was the New World Darkness, it was more of a we're still keeping some of the assumptions, but how who those groups are and how they relate to each other are a little more fragmented and different now. Um, so I mean, yeah, sure, there's definitely you can look at this game, which a lot of us have worked on, and said, okay, there's a lineage there certainly, and things that you enjoyed about those previous games. You'll probably find something like that in Curseborne, but on the other hand, for obviously for legal reasons, but also for much more strongly for creative reasons, we wanted to try just some new stuff. And I think the biggest change is that while both of the Of Darkness games previously had all these different supernatural species coexisted on some level, there was always a explicit or implicit barrier between them. You can have a major werewolf and a vampire in the same game, but you always felt like the game was kind of looking at you askance, going, "You probably shouldn't be doing that." I mean, you can, but maybe you don't want to. And even the setting was like, but these groups don't get along and they fight each other, and so they shouldn't hang out. And with Curseborne, we went radically in the opposite direction. Is that in out of the gates, you could all the different lineages are playable, and the idea was that we expect people to one person you're playing the vampire and I'm playing the werewolf, and you're playing the ghost and you're playing the mage. And it's built from the ground up with those kinds of assumptions. So with that comes some very different elements, which I think gives the whole thing a very distinctive flavor.
All right, so you're telling me that the first edition werewolf book lied to me and that it was very easy to drop a gangrel into my werewolf game? Oh,
Well, it's
years, years
I
of
mean,
illusion shattered.
I mean, it's true. I mean, because like you can do that, but
Oh yeah.
I remember this was 6, 7 years ago, quite a while now. But at one of the conventions I went to, it was Midwinter Gaming Convention in Milwaukee. Actually, I was like, I'm going to run a Giovanni family game, and the idea was not every single person was playing a Giovanni vampire, but every single member was related to the Giovanni family. So like there were a couple of Giovanni vampires, there were a couple of vampires that were Giovanni by blood but embraced by different clans, and there was also a werewolf, there was a ghost, and I think there was a mage as well. And people just acted like nobody had ever done this before, right? So I think while certainly the books said that a lot of the you can play these together, and I even wrote some material that's saying yeah, absolutely you should play this and pointed to cross-referencing things. It built up this kind of expectation, both how the setting was sent and also just how people engaged with it, that felt like you shouldn't do that. Like as a random example, I used to be very heavily involved in World Darkness live action, and the games that you would play in were defined by the kind of character you like. You could play in the vampire game or you could play in the werewolf game, and you don't really bring your gangrel to the werewolf game. That's just not something you do. So I mean, yes, it was mechanically easy to do, but it was and still is, I think, to a degree, kind of culturally looked down on because, well, that's a separate book. The vampires are in this book over here, and the werewolves are in that book over there, and they're not supposed to be in the same thing. So with something like Curseborne, because they know it's all in the same book, it seems like it's a small change on that level, but it really does unlock a lot of possibilities, and also to be able to then like I said, from the ground up, if you're writing a book about vampires, right? Obviously, the material you could put in there is primarily be focused on vampires. If you write a book about werewolves, the same thing. That's just the nature of, if you put that in the title, that's what people are going to expect when you see into it. If you don't have that on the title, then you can do stuff like, here is this family of vampires, and they hate this family of sorcerers, and that family of sorcerer are actually allied with this group of undead, and they both kind of work together against this family of vampires, but also they work kind of opposite to this family of vampires. And I think that just being a little clearer about that frees people up. And again, like for the people who've been playing these games for almost 25 years now, it could seem revelatory, even though a lot of the fiction we're tying to the much more modern version of it. This is a more common setup. Look at your Dresden Files or your Vampire Diaries, whatever. Things have come out since the World Darkness started that much more assume a cosmopolitan makeup of protagonists.
No, that makes sense. And you were talking about lineages. What kind of lineages does Curseborne have? I know some things have been coming out, but I assume vampires, werewolves, sorcerers.
Right. There are 5 lineages, and each of them have families under that. So let me kind of break it down a little bit. There's the hungry, which are basically vampires, although some of them can hunger for other things besides blood. So there are some hungry that feed off of emotion, some that feed off of flesh, some that feed off have bathed in blood. So it's vampires, but also kind of expanding the possibilities of vampires, again, that some more modern traditions, even older traditions bring in. There are the primal, which are shape-shifting creatures. So generally, again, a lot of them are going to change into various kinds of predators, which is pretty common. Wolves being a very popular one, but also they can transform into other kind of feral creatures, or even kind of just more monstrous versions of people. So anything that is primarily based around becoming more terrifying, and also with a strong element of anger, that can also fit into the primal. There are the dead, which are again primarily ghosts, but also assumption of that they are possessing their original corpses and then expanding out from there. So you can just be a ghost that free floats around and passes through walls, or something closer to like the Crow, where you possess your body to try to take vengeance on the people that came after you. There are the sorcerers, which again, you're magicians, so they're going to be much more comfortable with magic. But also, a lot of them have done something to bargain for this power. So, unlike other interpretations of mages that we've gone into, this is much more of a you owe somebody something. So you're kind of in that cycle of debt on a mystical level. And then finally, probably the more outre of the lineages are the outcasts. And the outcasts are descended from beings known as archons that come from the outside, which are just other dimensions beyond this world. And so they have a form lurking under their body that looks different from humanity. And if people can see that form, they just realize how alien you are and disengage from you. So there's a lot of the fallen angels or demons that in there. So certainly if you like those things, you'll like it too. But again, all of these can be kind of expanded and tweaked in different ways, which is where the families come in. The families are the actual groups that you belong to, and many of them are biological families, just like we would expect. Some of them are families of choice, and some of them are families in name only, but are really more like cults or pyramid schemes or whatnot. And each of them has a different kind of slant on it. So, for example, to go back to the Hungry, one family is House Bathory. So they descended from, Elizabeth Bathory, who famously bathed in blood to keep herself young for as long as possible. So they also find that by immersing themselves in blood, they get power. And that's more kind of we're all descendant or related to or somehow adopted by people who can claim lineage back to the original Bathory. But also there are the Blackhearts, which are vampires who just nobody likes, and so they stick together because nobody else will take them in. And the reason why nobody likes them is because they feed off of emotions. They need emotions, and so a very easy emotion to inspire is outrage. So they're required to just piss people off on a regular basis. So they have to stick around people who at least kind of get that that's one of the things you're going to do. But also they're parasocial vampires on a very literal level. They build up a relationship with someone just to suck the emotion out of them and then leave them behind. So they don't make friends easy for obvious reasons. And so that's not a family in a traditional sense. That's much more just a group of people that hang out because they need to support each other because nobody else possibly understands it. But even then, they don't quite entirely connect, because if they do, then maybe they're inadvertently playing into another Blackheart's game and maybe get their emotions sucked out of them. So that's just two families from one lineage to show you the wide diversity of possibility you can have.
Sure. I'm real happy this game did not come out in the 90s. Otherwise, or the 90s attitude didn't come about, because could you imagine Rush Limbaugh as a Blackheart, or Matt Walsh, more contemporary, written into the setting?
There are no politicians that I can possibly think of who would have that kind of element now.
Yeah, no, not at all. So, okay, very cool. So this is using the Storypath Ultra, and I know that
Yes.
Storypath Ultra was pioneered, so to speak, with World Below. And I know World Below was tweaked slightly to create a specific mood of an OSR game. What kind of tweaks are happening with Curseborne to create a more horror-inspired game using the system?
There are quite a few. Many of them are going to be either so small or so inside baseball that kind of will be hard to explain. But I think the big ones, the main one I think is the curse dice, and how curse dice work are that as you as you can build up curse dice as a power resource, and these actually replace dice in your dice pool. So you basically have two different colors of dice, let's say black and red, and you start adding black dice to your red dice as you build up curse dice. And to use your powers, you either have to hold a certain number of curse dice, which means you just have to have them to be able to activate your power, or bleed them, which means you have to get rid of them. And the reason why this matters is that the results you get specifically on curse dice generally cause things to go bad around you. So the more curse dice you hold, the more spells you can get access to, the more powerful spells you can use. But it also means that things are going to more consistently go bad to you and the people around you, the people you're acting on. Curses are going to start happening more commonly because the hits you generate on those can only be spent on things that can go bad. So like hits on normal dice, say for example, would cause someone additional damage, but hits on curse dice, as a random example, cause them to horribly break their arm, or to give them intense pain, something that's just way beyond what it needs to be. With the outcasts, if you, in certain cases, people start to have better chance to see that inhuman monster underneath you, so if you start. So you want to sometimes use powers to bleed those dice off so that you don't have those around. But then again, you don't have. So there's a constant push and pull of, I'm trying to get this resource so I can do more things, but this resource also makes it harder for me to be subtle. Okay. And that's kind of one aspect of the horror side of it. The other one is that you can play the game in a wide variety of ways. We're trying to make sure that this game has a lot of options available to it. But one of the core assumptions is that you are trying to work against your family. So all the families, this is something that's come up as people look at the game. It's like all the families are kind of jerks. And it's like, why would you play one of these people? It's like, because you want to stop your family from being jerks. You want to push against what these established people have put into place to try to make something a little bit better, carve out a small chunk. And so when your own family is against you and all you have are friends who also have complex relationships with their families, that's another piece of the horror. Is it's not just some vague large corporation or society of vampires making the world objectively horrible all across. It's your uncle is making your life bad for you. Your grandma is making things bad for you. And so there's a very kind of personal horror that comes with it. And even if you try to play into your family's conceits and try to go along with the family, at some point in time, that family's going to piss off a different family. And so you're going to have people coming after you, wanting to kill you just because of your last name or just because of the people you owe allegiance to. So you can never entirely escape. And so we have a mechanic called bonds in Storypath Ultra. And one of my favorite mechanics, actually. Bonds allow you to get more dice and more enhancements because of how you connect to someone. So a positive example for a positive bond, if, say, someone is your best friend, and you're the best friends bond with them at, say, 4. If they are being chased by a monster and they're falling behind, you could say, I'm going to grab them, pull them along, but I don't have a huge amount of might, I'm not very strong, but I can spend my relationship to my best friends to give me more dice to make sure I save them because they matter that much to me. I'm literally using my relationship to help save them. But there are negative bonds too. So like you could really hate your dad and you can have, a negative bond of 3 to your dad and use those dice against him, right? I know that you want me to be this, but I'm not going to. I know that hurts you. So I'm going to cash in my dice to really make sure the social attack against you hits. But that means they can do the same to you too. So that's another piece of it, is these personal relationships aren't just cool roleplay fodder, although they're obviously also that. But on top of that, it can literally turn into dice for and against you. So that's another aspect of the horror. And again, the world below has access to bonds too, but that's something else that we can kind of dip into and meaningful level because we have this family conceit to kind of build around.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I do love how Freudian the descriptions of these games go. You have a best friend
Yes.
and you want to save them, but fuck your dad. Like,
Certainly, there's a certain amount of my teenage self that I'm channeling when I just came. You're not my real dad.
Oh man. Okay, very cool. So, what are some of the powers, and where are we at? And I guess I hate to use the word power scaling because I think that's not exactly what we're trying to convey. But like on a level of like to go back to the World of Darkness examples, are we talking like level 1 disciplines, or are we talking like sphere magic in terms of how strong some of these families are?
I think it's about somewhere in the middle, honestly, which is kind of a non-answer. But to break it down, we do have a dot mechanic called entanglement. And entanglement is basically how enmeshed you are into the web of curses. So the more enmeshed you are in the web of curses, the more of these curses can flow through you, and therefore you can turn them into abilities, but also means obviously your life gets more powerful, or your life gets more shitty. So both, actually. And on a really basic fundamental level, it's stuff like blood potency or werewolf rank. It's the dot that tells you how powerful you are. And in the first book, we're going to have access to entanglement levels 1 to 4, and that will be the first tier of spells. Then we're looking at future books where we'll go up to higher levels of entanglement and we'll unlock bigger levels of spells. One of the things that we kind of wanted to move away from is completely locked in power sets that were completely different, right? Mage magic works one way, werewolf gifts work a different way, vampire gifts work a third way, and never in the middle shall they meet. So part of what happens is if I want to turn invisible as a mage or a werewolf or a vampire, they all work in slightly different ways. And then if you do want it to cross them over, it's say, okay, my obfuscate power works this way against auspex. The werewolf doesn't have auspex, but they have a different power that sees things that are invisible that works for their invisible things. How does that relate to this, right? So that was one reason we wanted to move away from that. The other thing was also if you have something like I can, the vampires that can eat emotion, obviously spells that tie into that would make sense for them. But also all of the dead on some level have strong ties to emotions. So rather than rebuilding all of those, it's maybe this specific family, because they have a bit of a resonance to how the dead work, maybe they get access to a family secret that only they know. That's actually one of the dead spells that you can use even though you're hungry. But aside from that kind of mixing and matching, we did want to make sure two things. We still want to make sure that the powers were evocative and flavorful for the different lineages. So vampires should still do vampire things, and werewolves should do werewolf things, and so on. But also something that Danielle, who's the lead developer on this, and Matthew, who brought her on board. So I keep thinking a lot of we, but really I kind of only been on the fringes of a lot of this. But something that I know Danielle was very kind of hard on was that she wanted to make sure that out of the gate the powers felt cool. And what that means in meaningful terms is that every spell should feel like it has a useful and tangible effect at the game table. And to be honest, some of those early disciplines and gifts don't pass that test. I mean, as much as I love my bone gnars, being able to make a dinner out of rocks is not exactly a super exciting power to have, It
has come up a stupid amount of times in my current game, though.
Well, I've tried to use stone soup in a variety of ways, and it's like, oh yeah, I have stone soup. I mean, so it's like when you have it, it's cool, but it's also not something not a go-to gift.
Sure,
right?
sure, yeah.
And so something we tried to do more of is to say, how are these kind of evocative out of the gate, and then as they go up entanglement, that was another piece of it. Was we didn't want to have a thing where, again, this happens in disciplines and gifts a lot, where a later, more powerful version more or less makes an early version obsolete.
Yeah.
So instead of having 5 different invisibility powers, now it's this one that specifically makes you invisible. As you go up in enhancements, you could add on things that make that more powerful. And then also we can then do fun stuff like, okay, maybe this family has a specific secret that allows them to twist a spell in a very specific certain way. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there. And for people who know how to manage the numbers and min-max things, that does mean that, yes, it's entirely possible you'll find some game-breaking solutions in there. But I think the larger benefit of being able to say, anybody who says, I want to play a cool ghost and I want to do cool ghost stuff, and being able to look at this initial spells and going, yeah, oh, there's cool ghost stuff and I can do that. And then if the table goes, hey, I feel like I'm doing cool ghost stuff, making sure that out of the box experience feels really good, which means that as a result of that, naturally they're going to feel a little more powerful than some of the earlier games. But it's not as flexible as just, I don't know, matter 2 times 3, I guess. Sure, do whatever the hell you want. Which I love Mage, but on some level, it's basically just if the game master decides that number of dots looks up, will do whatever thing you pulled out of your ass. So this is kind of a balance between the two, is that you can pick and choose, and with very specific circumstances, get spells that are outside of your wheelhouse and add those in, and also evolve and change them in very specific ways. But you're not going to have that kind of turning people into lawn chairs moment. Yeah. At least not yet. Maybe down the road.
Maybe down the road, yeah. You know, the games where it's just like, all right, storyteller, we're going to get creative. Okay, I'm going to have to drink a lot before the game just to make sure that the ideas are flowing.
Right. Let me introduce you to my friend, Mr. Paradox, because that is the only way I can keep you yahoos in control.
All right. You're making me pull out the cocaine. I guess it's one of those kinds of sessions tonight. Like...
Oh, yeah, I've had a few of those. And not that I actually got to cocaine, but certainly a few of the sessions where it's just like, come on, really?
Yeah.
All right.
It's even more impressive if you set the difficulty 10 and you're like, oh, you need 2 successes, they still make it, and you're just like, fuck, okay.
Why did I say yes to this? I should have said no.
I should have just said no. Yep. Well, you were hoping for that botch. You get that, like...
Right.
Let hubris take him down. Oh, no, how the turns table. Like... But okay, so I want to backtrack a little bit on because the concept of the world is that everything carries a kind of curse, and we were kind of joking about, you know, capitalism and all that, but like what does it mean for everything to kind of carry a curse? What does that kind of look like in the setting and the milieu of the game?
In a way, I think it helps explain some of things, like if you read the original World Darkness or Chronicle of Darkness, there's usually some form of it's our world but darker, and then everything is just a bit more gothic, a bit dirtier, a bit nastier. People are a bit more of jerks, and but that's only kind of vaguely explains. If you get deep into the Mage books in their respective lines, sometimes they kind of get into, okay, here's why it's actually this way, but it's a bit more metaphysical, and it's just kind of, it's that way because it's a horror game, it needs to be that way. Whereas with Curseborne, being able to say everything is cursed, you're in a horror setting, but it's not that way just because it's a horror setting. And the nice thing about that is, because everything is cursed, and curses are on some level something your characters engage with, it does mean that, at least early on, some of the early curses you can kind of play with a bit. So if you have the right build, and if you have the right momentum, if you have the right approach and the right characters and the right relationships, you might be able to make life a little bit better for a couple people. Because as an accursed, which is the player character name, you're one of the accursed, is that you have a relationship with curses, which means that you can actually adjust and fudge them on them and create them. You can make more curses too. It's definitely a kind of sliding slope, in a sense of, yes, you can make this one area maybe a little bit better, but there's a lot of other things going on. And also, there are certainly curses that are so far above your pay grade that you can't possibly even begin to it. There are some very primordial curses, many of them actually created and formed the families. Like great granddad made a deal with the devil, and now our family's cursed, and there's no way you're telling the devil to take that curse off, kind of thing. This family of sorcerers killed a fae 300 years ago in Ireland, and the fae are still mad about that, and they still remember. So there's some curses that are just so strong and etched into the world they're going to be almost impossible to shift. But because everything is on some level a curse, and curse is something that on some level characters can engage with, theoretically, with enough power, depending on how the books evolve, any curse can be at least be engaged with. So you have the possibility to make your horror game more or less of a horror game on a character level. I think that's an interesting component. And again, we're talking super high level here. That's something you do with on a regular basis, right? It's more of an additive effect. It's the there's this one guy at work that I really hate, and he's kind of halfway to suspecting I might be a vampire. So I'm just making his life a little bit miserable every single day, to hoping that eventually he just quits, and then I can push him out of my life. And then you find out that by making this guy's life miserable, he goes home and he starts abusing his family. And the family start fearing for their lives, and their family reach out to one of their friends, and their friends bring them in to help them out, and then they start losing money, and so their friends reach out to an organization which turns out to be run by one of the other player characters accursed. And so now the way you've made this person's life miserable is actually impacting one of the other player characters on some level. It's weaponizing horror genre in a way that I don't think it's quite been done, at least to my mind. It may have been done in other games, because everything's been done on some level, but it makes each of these components a little more mechanical, something you can actually dig your teeth into a little bit. Again, not in a kind of, I roll 12 dice to make this guy's life better. It's not exactly that simple, but it is more of the, I can remove this status effect and move it to somebody else. And so this person's life's better, but this person's life has now gotten a bit worse. And just knowing that all of these things are in some way something you can engage with gives you a feeling of power, which is something a lot of horror games don't have. Because one of the ideas is that this is more of a hope punk game where, yes, everything's awful, but by building the right community and by taking a stand against these kinds of oppression, you can actually make a small amount of change, and maybe even a large amount of change over time. So it is a horror game where you can fight back, but because it's a horror game, it's going to be a super long road, and you have to pick a lot of battles, and you may ruin yourself in the process. So it's not happy fun, but it is not also Call of Cthulhu or even some of the other of Darkness games where, yeah, life sucks, so just kind of suck it up and, make something for yourself out of it.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Call of Cthulhu, because Call of Cthulhu has been, at least in some of the more recent adventure books, moving away from that hopelessness too, and I think that's because of the zeitgeist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their Time for Harvest, well, to be fair, I am very impressed with Chaosium these more recent years, because they have a whole disclaimer in the front going, this adventure deals with this, this, and this, and if you or your players are uncomfortable, do not buy this book. And it goes, and hey, don't spring these things as surprises on your players. Tell them it is better to spoil a surprise and no one be hurt. And all that, but it's called A Time to Harvest, and it's basically got a Children of the Corn scene, so, harming children. So that's why they specifically call it out. But, yeah, it goes, hey, all this is happening, but you can stop this, and it won't come for years, but you made a difference here in the now. And I think the zeitgeist is moving away from that sort of hopelessness that kind of defined World of Darkness, especially in the 90s. Because the world is kind of reflecting it back at us too much to where we need a bit more hope. So I just find that bit a little interesting.
Yeah, because if you want to get real reductive, World of Darkness called itself originally Gothic punk, but I think in hindsight, it definitely leans more on the Gothic than the punk side. In the terms of everything was kind of crumbling and falling apart, and that's pretty much how life is, which is literally Gothic a vibe, as opposed to the punk, and you could do something about that. And the Chronicles of Darkness was pretty much from the gate kind of meant much more of a noir setting, which is that you are maybe decent people, but you have a handful of bad decisions. You have to make the least bad one. Which again, I love both of those vibes. There's nothing wrong with either of those vibes.
Oh, yeah.
But you're right in the sense that neither of those have aged well in regards of what the zeitgeist is. The zeitgeist is much more of the, listen, we already live in a Gothic punk world on some level. I don't want to necessarily play powerlessness in the face of oppressive horribleness. I want to do something about it because I don't have that in my own life. And so I think having a game that we can say, okay, here's a chunk of that, but to make that conflict matter and to keep the vibe correct, that does mean that we have to say like literally everything is awful. I mean, it's not quite that oppressive, but you know, when we say everything is cursed, it's also things like, okay, this guy stubbed his foot on his stairs going out today. It's a tiny curse, but it's something. So not everything is life threatening and shattering, but everything's gonna stumble a bit. Which actually goes to another mechanical thing is Ultra has and Storypath 2 has this concept of complications, where you can succeed at something, but if you don't buy off the complication, something slightly goes wrong. It's very much a qualified success, and I love that relationship and that mechanical dynamic. So with Curseborne, we just amp that up. There's lots of things that give you complications, and we find ways to encourage you to spend your hits in other places besides buying off that complication. And so that guys into it. It's the I'm exhausted. I have a history of exhausted, which means that everything's a little harder to do. And on one hand, mood, that's like my life these days, it seems. But also that ties into the whole vibe of the thing is that everything's a little bit hard, and so if you're pushing against that and saying, but I still want to make a difference, I still want to fix this one thing, then I feel like that does hit the balance between them, and it does feel much more modern than something that comes from that kind of just oppressive, everything is awful, edgy stuff that came out of the 90s.
Yeah. I will say 2020 was the hardest time to run Werewolf of the entire
God.
6 years. Because we're I think this game is 6 or 7 years old now. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so just when COVID hit, I'm just like, yeah, there's an evil corporation just completely, taking advantage of horrible situations. Anyway, let's turn off our TVs and just jump into the fantasy of this werewolf game. Nothing to see here. Like,
So, as much as I really enjoy talking with people in the community and fans of the games, I do have this small category of things that rent through my head of just how in the hell did you get here fan comments. And one of my favorite is it came out about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and someone's like, I don't know when Werewolf the Apocalypse got so political with all of their tirades against corporations and environmental problems. And I'm just like, have you never played a Werewolf the Apocalypse game?
I am deeply convinced that if you want to find a fan base that doesn't read more than tabletop role players, you're going to be hard pressed.
I know, right? And the worst part is that it's a community that is in love with the fact that it reads, and it's like, but a few of you just really don't.
I would say actually most don't. I think, funny enough, for how much the newest edition of Werewolf tirades against oral tradition, tabletop is an oral tradition more so than a reading tradition. One person
That's
reads,
true.
and then the rest is expanded verbally. So all you have to do is have one person with bad reading comprehension to shotgun to everyone.
No, that's really fair. I know a couple times when I was working on Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition, I would have people come up to me. It's like either one of two things, which is either, oh my God, this thing is totally new and I love it, which has been in the books for 20 years, or why didn't you do this X thing that never existed but accepted their home table? So this is a fair point. There is a lot of oral tradition in these games. That's really a cool idea. I have to think about that some. That's neat.
Yeah, and there's a Mandela effect with Werewolf specifically that I noticed, because when I first ran
Yeah.
Werewolf, it was, for some reason, I thought you could spend a point of Gnosis to auto step sideways. And I looked in the book years later, I'm like, oh, no, I just made that up. And I mentioned that to two other people. I'm like, can you not spend Gnosis to step sideways? And they'd been playing the game longer than me. And I'm like, no, you can't.
It's hilarious you mention that because I thought the exact same thing. And when I worked on Werewolf 20, I went to Ethan. I was like, "Where's this rule? What about you should spend a Gnosis?" And Ethan's like, "What are you talking about?" Ethan Scamp was like, "I've never heard of that." And I'm like, "Really?" And I think I get fact check me on this. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was any version of the Werewolf LARP rules, and I think that's how it kind of got
Oh.
osmosis back in the tabletop.
Well, maybe, but I never read the LARP rules. I think it was
No,
because
but LARPers also play the games, and they
Oh,
tell their friends,
sure.
"Oh, this is how it worked in the LARP."
Oh,
and then
sure,
it
but I
passes
taught
around.
myself. So I taught myself. So it might have been the LARP rules, but I think part of it too is that, oh, if you spend Rage, X happens. And obviously, if you spend Gnosis, Y will happen. Like, I think it's an assumption jump.
That's fair. It's
I
I
think
spend
it's an
rage so I can murder people better. If I spend spiritual stuff, I can do spiritual stuff better. That's a
yeah,
logical connection.
yeah, exactly. I think that's what happened there. But I don't know. I leave in the comments below if you thought you could spend Gnosis to step sideways. Get that engagement up.
It's even funnier too because also there are not only different communities that have those different rules, but also different cultures, different languages. Because some of the translations, translating between languages is very much an art as well as a science, and you can never get an exact change. And so I remember specifically some French fans coming up to me talking about the original storytelling system, and they're like, we just don't understand why what happens to this one rule about splitting dice pools. And it's like, yeah, and we split a dice pool. Each dice pool also gets 2 additional dice. I'm like, I have never heard of this rule. And apparently it was in the French translations of some vampire books and got recopied into other French translations of World Darkness books. And so the French community was like, of course, this rule's been there the entire time. And I just never read a French book. It's like, I have no idea what we're talking about here. It took us a while to finally find out that was the problem because I'm like pulling up the book going, no, it's not in this book. It's wild how that stuff kind of just
That is wild.
sticks around.
No, it is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. No, I've been thinking about that recently, the oral tradition. I've been thinking about it more and more, and I'm like, yeah, almost none of my players have read the books. Like, even though they're all there. Yeah, I think it is an oral tradition, and I think that's why it's real weird for me personally for all the online tools happening and things like that, because I think that there becomes a disconnect to that long oral tradition of tabletop games, because now you have a program enforcing those rules rather than all the various misconceptions or laziness in my part, like you start taking a penalty if you take more rage actions than you have dexterity. I don't want to keep track of that.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned that because there is something I've noticed for newer gamers, and I'm wondering if that oral tradition part ties into it because some people who have been playing only the past few years, so basically from COVID on, have discovered tabletop role playing games. I have heard stories of some of them when they get these prepackaged adventures where they run it strictly according to what's written, and if it's not mentioned in there, not only do they feel uncomfortable extrapolating, which is certainly understandable for newer game masters, but rather they don't understand why you would, right? It's just a complete disconnect of like, no, I can't make it up because it's not in the book. And the first time I heard it, I was like, okay, that's weird, but move on. But I kept hearing more and more of it. But I'm wondering if it ties to that because if you go from the conceit of tabletop role-playing games as oral tradition, then obviously there's a bit of everything that moves and changes and whatnot, and you're kind of adjusting and moving on the fly. It's not necessarily a lack of creativity, but if you've been taught through a virtual tabletop or a set of digital tools, and they're constantly reinforcing to you, no, you have to play this way because that's what it won't let you play any other way. So therefore, when I get to the rules that tell me how to run an adventure, obviously I must run it this way because that's what the tools have taught me. That's an interesting bit that I'm still kind of connecting in my head right now, but that's a really interesting concept.
That could be part of it. I think part of it also is born out of the tradition of the 3-point XD&D, because 3-point XD&D tried to make a rule for everything, which is still impossible. But because there was almost a rule for everything, at least when I got into the hobby, I was less comfortable just winging it initially. It took other systems to where it's just like, here's the basic framework, go, that got me out of that mindset. I think part of that is ingrained from 3.5 on. But yeah, I do think the digital tools, right? Because you can technically do things slightly different in those digital tools, but you have to write it all yourself and do it all from scratch, and that creates a much larger barrier to entry for house ruling than had previously existed versus your player going, how do I do this? You do it like this.
Right. But it's fascinating to me is certainly I think D&D 3 maybe exacerbated that, but it does actually go all the way back to the very beginning in the sense that if you find super early editions of Dragon Magazine, right, there's a letter column for the first 100, maybe even 200 issues where you would literally write in saying, here's what happened in my game, and they would give you an official ruling in that letter column. And what was happening is there would be players writing saying, our game master, our DM said this, and we think it's wrong. And TSR would say, yep, your DM is wrong, and they should give you those things back. It was that authoritative.
Wow.
And then when other companies didn't have or either the resources or inclination to provide that kind of service, people were left to kind of make their own rulings. And so that's where the kind of do it on your own DIY vibe of tabletops actually started. It didn't really start with D&D. It started slightly aside from D&D. And then lots of reasons TSR moved in different directions, but I think it's always been kind of irreducible from D&D specifically, that you have to play it a very specific way. And I think that's kind of embedded in very specifically the D&D portion of the culture. But because a lot of us play D&D or are familiar with D&D, because it is kind of the lingua franca to a degree of tabletop role-playing games, that does bleed out in other parts. But I'm wondering now on some level if as you mentioned, the digital tools aren't in some ways a different version of that same problem. Is like as opposed to TSR telling me how I have to play, it's now literally a tool telling me how I have to play, and so therefore I must engage with this very specific way. So it's always been there, but it's fascinating to me that it's not people anymore that's mandating that, it's tools, and that's the part that I'm kind of spinning in my head. But I do agree that the D20 boom basically literally incentivized you to make money off of telling people how to play their game. That's really what it came down to, is like, I want to play this game, but with mechs. And it's like, cool, great. I'm going to sell you a book that tells you exactly how to do that. And so lots of publishers made money by telling people how to play their games correctly. So yeah, there was definitely a chunk of that.
Yeah. Where were we?
What a
tangent. Video essay coming? Never. I'm not a video essayist. No, to go back to Curseborne then, are there built-in animosities between these factions? And if there are, like the families and the lineages, and if there are, how do you square that circle of players of these different families being in the same group? I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. And the answer is that there are some built-in family animosities, but not between lineages, right? So it's not all hungry hate all sorcerers. It's nothing like that. But my family of hungry might have a rivalry with your family of sorcerers. But because we're using the family language, there's very natural and organic ways we can do stuff like it's a Hatfield McCoy kind of situation of like, our families have always fought for centuries, and I hate you purely because I have been trained from birth to hate you. But also you can choose Romeo and Juliet kinds of things where it's like, two families, unalike and hate each other, but these two individuals from this family have found a way to connect. So because we're moving from supernatural organizations and structures and moving to families, I think there's more buy-in of, yeah, my family hates your family, but you're playing a member of that family, I'm playing a member of this other family, but we get along, and we don't like the fact that our families are fighting. And that becomes a story seed of like, well, can we work with our families to maybe build a peace? Can we shift that vibe? And then also like, okay, maybe my branch of the family feels this way about this other family, but this other branch that, the Minnesota vampires don't like this, but the other family do. And so even chunks inside the family may have different takes on this, and maybe there may be splits and diversions because of that. It's hard-coded in the sense of we want to make sure that when you pick a family, you have a good idea of, okay, these are people you kind of like, these are people you kind of hate, and on a family level, and you can decide what to do with that, what you want. Because I think it helps build a better world if people see that these relationships exist, as opposed to just 31 sterile things in isolation that have no relationship to each other. And no, these guys hate these guys and love these guys, and these work together, and these guys screwed each other over 50 years ago. I think all that works sense, but I think just because of the nature of how we're presenting this stuff, it's not like, oh, I'm in the Cam and you're in the Sabbat, and so therefore we can never get along. It's more of the, yes, my family founder killed your family founder 150 years ago, but I don't know any of these people. I don't even know why we're fighting. Why can't we just hang out and have a beer?
All right. Excellent. Though now I've got Minnesota vampires stuck in my head. Like, oh yeah, them
Oh, yeah.
werewolves are a bunch of hosers, right?
You get also like hyphenated names of like, oh no, we're from the Boston branch of the family. We're from those Minnesota families.
Excellent. So this was an idea I had, and this is me coming from it from a purely story guide, GM, whatever your favorite proprietary term is for getting people introduced into the game. Is there a prelude? You're just people until you're led into the family, or you start to discover your powers option built into Curseborne, or is the assumption that you'll just start out with that, and you kind of have to homebrew it, back to our previous discussion, to kind of get that ramp up for your players?
The default assumption is that you maybe are still discovering what's going on with you and your family, but at the time that we check in with you, at the time you start playing, you at least know the basics. So there isn't a ghoul gameplay kind of level out of the gate. That's something that we may look at for other options. We may even consider for this book, because one of the things it's been great about this process is we're doing lots of actual plays with people, and also we had the ash can out, and so we're getting lots of feedback, and we've actually been adjusting and modifying the manuscript as we go. So I don't want to rule anything out, but we have found, based on talking with people and playing, hearing about not only our horror games but other games like, say, Scion, that the amount of people who like the ramp up option are pretty low.
Fair enough.
So, for example, let's just take Scion as a pretty good example. We had Origin, and then we had Hero, Demigod, and God. And most people like going to the hero level and kind of just hang out there. There are lots of people who like to play before to learn that you've become a god. Some people love to play what happens after you've become a hero and into your godhood. Those are all viable options, and people really love them. But the majority of people just want to get into I figured out that I'm a child of a god. I have cool god powers. I want to start playing with those.
Sure.
So that's kind of where and also because it makes more sense for the compatibility component if the vampire, werewolf, and demon are already friends, going to the coffee house and bitching about their families. So having those, we have bonds because we have this commonality and this common frustration, again, makes sense. But it's also pretty easy to just to ease into that because characters are built with paths. And one of your paths is your lineage, one of your paths is your family, and one of your paths is your background, your origin, if you will, what you do outside of being an accursed. So you can just say, like, you don't have access to your spells yet, and you start playing your character as written, and maybe slight a few dots off, and you can ease into that if you want to, certainly. But I think, to use the term prelude, I think it's probably, if you did that, probably closer to a traditional World Darkness style prelude of you'd run that individually with each player as a short session to get them up to it, but then once the characters are together, that's when they're fully aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think part of it is the amount of lore to some degree that really determines that. So if this game is a little more easy to lore wise, you don't have several books worth,
100 books.
100 books worth of backstory. Like for the werewolf game, it was individual players up till their first change, and they're all in the same sept, and it's still a prelude allowing them to spend points for like 3-4 sessions and going, this is the worm, this is the weaver,
right,
here's this obscure term that you're going to not write down in your notes, but I guarantee it'll come up 100 more times, and you're going to put them in your notes, and I know how this goes. I've been running this game for a while. I know how it goes. So that's
a good point, but I will say on the flip side that we do want this to be a game about mysteries, so the why are my family assholes and what caused them to start going this way, that is something that you can start to slowly uncover over time. But to your point, yeah, it's interesting. I never actually verbalized it this way, but you brought it up. But a lot of the World of Darkness games, a default starting character has to have a lot of background knowledge about how the world works before they can effectively start playing. Whereas Curseborne, you don't have that. It's you're some kind of inhuman creature and you have magic powers, go. It's basically all you need to know. The world's cursed. Great. And then as a fully coherent character doing cool supernatural stuff, then you can start to explore the world. Whereas you're right, with the World of Darkness specifically, you kind of had to learn about how the world works before you can even start to be that cool supernatural character.
Yeah, and instead of giving a lecture, it's way more fun to play it. So
Yes,
that
true.
was my workaround, so to speak. But
No, that makes sense. And I've done games like that too, where it's like, let me, you play with a fragmented version of your character to just learn how everything works as kind of a tutorial. Is how I usually call it. You're playing the tutorial for a while, and then you know how the game works. Then you can start as a full character once you know how to, push right to go across screen and jump or whatever. It's the same thing. It's like, here's because you can't play a werewolf game without knowing what the worm is, right? You can't play a werewolf game
yeah,
knowing how packs work. Those are such fundamental things that if you don't know how to do them, some of your stuff on your sheet doesn't make sense. It's that
yes,
fundamental. Whereas with Curseborne, there are certain things you have to know, but they can be covered in like, and literally, I would say they can be covered in a short talk, and I cut myself off, but like because how the lineage sections are written, for example, it is a character talking to you, and a lot of our how we explain stuff to people is written in character voices. And
hmm
in fact, we have certain characters that explain concepts through you throughout the book, because it is to go back to your oral tradition. It's the accursed are on some level an oral tradition. So the whole hey kid, okay, you're a vampire now. Let me pull you in a corner and tell you how this works. That's actually just reading the hungry section, and then each of the families has a different character, a member of that family, either talking up the family, saying how great the family is, and then alluding to some of the problems it has, or vice versa, someone who's very frustrated with their family, going, "Let me tell you all the bullshit my family has to go through." So you actually have characters on the page telling you that as you're making the character, as
okay,
opposed to you basically having to kind of work around that to have run an entire kind of subsidiary game before you get to the actual game.
yeah, okay. No, that all makes sense. We're getting close to the end of our time, so I was just wondering if you had any final thoughts you wanted to impart to our listeners regarding Curseborn. Anything you want to really just drive home?
Yeah, I think the big thing is that we are going to be on Kickstarter. It's going to be running through October. Um, Hopefully, by the time you're listening to this or watching this, we should have a link circulating around so you can sign up and be notified when it launches. But if you're not familiar with Onyx Path crowdfunding campaigns, we do give you the entire manuscript throughout the course of the campaign, and you don't get charged until the campaign's over. So my recommendation, if you're remotely interested, pledge at a low level. You'll get the manuscript to you, and if you find it's not for you, you can dip out and it won't cost you a dime. And you have the manuscript downloaded so you can look at. So I mean, check it out. Also, we have the Ashcan, which is available on DriveThruRPG. So if you want to even get ahead of that, download that. There's an adventure in the back, pre-made characters. You can play through a game again, see if it's for you. But I think that once you give it a shot, once you look at it, if you are or were a fan of the previous horror games we've worked on, I think you'll see a lot here that you'll really like. And if you have been frustrated by other horror games that make you feel like you can't really do much with it, I'd say give it a shot because it's a slightly different take on horror, and I'm hoping a lot of people will like it, but I know I'm really excited about it.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Eddie. I really appreciate it. And I've been Keegan. This is a bunch of gamers, and you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Podbean, and several other places. But you'll never find me on Twitter. It was and remains to be a cesspool. Goodbye.